to be a light unto the nations. So it was both of these components. The question of Israel serving as a national refuge, a safe haven, was not a question when the state was being established. Because of what was happening in Europe, immediately in the aftermath of the Holocaust, yet that component of a refuge, a safe haven, remains today one of the stalwart pillars of the state. And we see this primarily after different events in Europe, anti-Semitic events that have taken place, when the prime minister of the country of Israel, Netanyahu, will stand up and say, "You have a home here." This is why in certain parts of Jerusalem, you have heavily populated areas of the French who have moved to Israel, because French Jews, because they recognize that France may not be or may not have a secure Jewish future. And so therefore they wanted to be part of a place in which they knew they would be able to have agency, protection, and choose to live a quote-unquote normal existence. This is part of this discussion. At the same time, you have a place that often when the prime minister speaks, will talk about how this place and who he speaks for is on behalf of all Jewish people. And then if you read in the Declaration of Independence, you will read something similar to that, in which he says, "We appeal to the Jewish people," or the document says, "We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel." So on one hand, you have this safe haven and this refuge, and on the other hand, you have the responsibility of the diaspora community to ensure that it continues to be a safe haven and refuge. But then you move to the 21st century, where you slowly begin to see that there is an increasing schism or an increasing gap between many North American Jews who live around in all different types of communities and Israeli Jews who have chosen to make the state their home. And that this increasing tension between these two populations has not yet been ameliorated in a meaningful way in terms of younger generations. Part of this is because of the challenge in terms of how Israelis vote and how American Jews vote. American Jews continue to vote for a left-of-center, democratic, more progressive administration, where the primary concerns are not necessarily Israel's primary concerns. This is an observation, this is not a value judgment. I'm stating how American Jews, for the most part, vote. Whereas Israeli Jews, whether you are left of center, or right of center, the majority continue to vote for an administration that is right of center. That does not mean that all Israeli Jews who vote for a right of center political leadership means that they want to go to war with Palestinians. It does not mean that they want to see continued struggle militarily. But rather, there is a sense within the Israeli political landscape that there are existential threats. Those existential threats come from Iran, they come from Syria, they come from Gaza, and potentially the West Bank. And in order to ensure and assure that the Jewish state can withstand those existential threats, a right-of-center political leadership has been the one deemed to be most fit to protect the Israeli citizenry. The misunderstanding of these two major centers of populations, American Jews, or North American Jews, and Jews living in Israel, have not had meaningful discussions around what this gap means and how they understand one another. So it raises a real question about this aspiration for the Jews who live in diaspora to continue to rally around the idea of this place. Although you in this room continue to do so, the next generation does not come to the table with the same motivations. They do not have the memories of the Holocaust. They do not have the memories of the establishment of the State of Israel. They do not have the memories of the 1967 war. They do not have the memories of Oslo. They do not have the memories at all that motivate you in your Zionistic ideas. Their motivations come from a place of wanting to understand how Israel can behave in a more universalistic way and in a less particularistic way, and focus not only on that component of what's happening internally within Israeli society, but also to clearly put in the center of the conversation the discussion about Israel's control over the West Bank for the past over 50 years. That is a primary motivation. Now, I want to be very clear that it is not to say that Israelis are not also concerned about that. They are. Many Israelis have been concerned about that as early as the 7th day of the Six-Day War. After the events of 1967, when it was clear that Israel now had acquired territories from the Golan, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai, there were discussions by David Ben-Gurion, who was not the prime minister, Levi Eshkol was, but by David Ben-Gurion and professor and mathematician and philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovitz from Hebrew University. Leibovitz was a religious Zionist. He was halachically observant, yet he also was a truly modernist engaged in questions of modernity, and he was a revered individual and an intellect. And David Ben-Gurion and Yeshayahu Leibovitz were speaking about, so now what does Israel do that it now has control over these territories? And Yeshayahu Leibovitz said to David Ben-Gurion, Israel must return the territories. That was the 7th day of the Six-Day War. Why did he say that? It's not because he didn't recognize that Judea and Samaria had religious significance, historical significance to the Jewish people. But rather, he said there are two primary reasons. The state cannot become worshipped. The state cannot become an idol for us as a population. And therefore, we need to put controls or restraints on how the state is constructed. Secondly, in order for the state to balance its universalism and particularism, in order for it to maintain its democratic nature, it cannot control another people that ultimately, in terms of demography, will become larger than the existing Jewish population. That was on the 7th day of the Six-Day War that debate began. It was a lively debate that went beyond those two intellectuals, beyond that room, and entered into the political landscape as well into the populace. The Israeli Jewish population, from left of center, from whether you want to talk about Uri Avneri, who was a farther left of center, to Mapam, to Labor and Mapai, and to others who were more centrist, even into the Likud, were willing to have that debate. The American Jewish community has been slower in having that debate in the way in which it has been done in the same style in Israel, in which everything can be put on the table, and positions can be argued, and positions can be articulated, and then ultimately democratic elections decide. Many in that progressive Jewish younger generation feel as if the American Jewish community and the American Jewish communal leadership in particular has been reluctant to engage in that debate. Historically, I can tell you that is not wholly accurate. That there have been many American Jewish communal leaders who have been willing to address these issues, but that conversation is one of the central conversations that is increasing some of those tensions between the Israeli Jewish population, or lack thereof, with the North American Jewish younger generation. Your children, your grandchildren. This is one of those differences between reality and aspirations. The second piece, in terms of returning to the safe haven, just to build on that one more time, is this discussion about for whom does the leadership of the state speak on behalf of. If you recall, in 1950, the American Jewish Committee, the leader, Jacob Blaustein, met then with David Ben-Gurion. And in the conversation that Jacob Blaustein had with David Ben-Gurion, he said very clearly, it is the job of the American Jewish communal landscape to support the American Jewish concerns. We will do our best, of course, to also provide support to Israel, but we must care about the American Jews here in America, and we need to make sure that American Jews do not feel as if they will face an accusation of dual loyalty. That was the primary concern. Remember, this is 1950, in which you had McCarthyism, in which you had Jews being questioned and communists being questioned for who they were most loyal to. It was also important for Blaustein to say to Ben-Gurion, "You, Ben-Gurion, have the right to speak on behalf of those who choose to make Aliyah and are citizens of the state, but you do not have the right to speak for Jews who live outside of your territory." It was also a letter in which Ben-Gurion and Blaustein discussed what is then the role of the American Jewish community. And Blaustein articulated that the role of the American Jewish community was specifically to ensure that Jews could acculturate into American society so that they could have influence at multiple levels of society, so that they could continue to have upward mobility and be seen as Americans, while at the same time being able to articulate their Jewishness. That was the discussion. It was also about, for Blaustein, ensuring that Israel itself would be a democracy. Why? Because this is when Russia cares deeply, right? The Soviet Union cares deeply about the Middle East, and there was a concern about whether or not Israel would become a socialist entity or a more Western democratic entity. And Blaustein made the case to Ben-Gurion why it was so important to be a democratic, Western-oriented entity and not an Eastern communist socialist entity. This is part of that conversation. The American Jewish community during that time frame was concerned about their role in America. They were feelings of how do we support this place that we may not move to, where we may not immigrate to, and the best actualization of that was seen through philanthropic means. The philanthropy changed over time, and that's when you begin to see philanthropic decisions that influence around whether or not Israel should hold on to places like the West Bank. And that's where much of that critical discussion and criticism actually begins to be manifest, even if it's not happening in Jewish communal organizational meetings, board meetings, or conversations in the synagogue. So this is part of the understanding between reality and aspirational desire. The other piece that I would like to talk about in terms of the case study is equality for all citizens. In the Declaration of Independence, we read, "The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations." If you ask any non-Jewish citizen of the state of Israel, it doesn't matter if they're Christian or if they're Muslim, almost any non-Jewish citizen will tell you Israel has not lived up to that. We saw that the passing of the nation-state law this past summer. The nation-state bill was a conversation that had been happening for several years. The desire was, by the Israeli political landscape, to think about how do you ensure that Israel remains a Jewish state and is clearly defined as a Jewish state. There were those who were outside of the government who said, rather than legislate this question, this should be a communal conversation with the citizens of the state of Israel, and it should be a bottom-up conversation that begins with an educational conversation about the role of civic identity as Israelis, not as Jews, not as Christians, not as Muslims, not as Arabs, but as Israelis, and what it means to be an Israeli, and what it means to be a citizen of the state that has a Jewish character and a democratic character. The individual who was put in charge of that particular conversation was a law professor, or is a law professor from Hebrew University, Ruth Gavasson. Ruth Gavasson is one of the most senior legal scholars at Hebrew University, and she wanted to see if she could find a way, working with a variety of constituents, to come up with a formula or a preamble that would satisfy the different citizens of the state of Israel to address this particular issue. Ruth Gavasson wrote some documents. Those documents were rejected primarily by the Arab intellectual elite, who are citizens of the state of Israel, the Palestinians who are citizens, because they did not take into consideration their concerns, their narratives, their perceived historical realities. And you had a huge disconnect between these sets of documents. Those documents written by the Palestinian Arab intellectuals were called the Future Vision documents. They began in about the early 2000 period, about 2005 or so, being written. And they were discussed by many of the Israeli Jews that Gavison had organized from the Israel Democracy Institute to write. And there was no bridge to link these two sets of documents together. As a result of the basic law, everyone knows that in Israel you have these basic laws that are passed because you don't have a constitution, but they form the basis for constitutional framework. So the basic law that was passed in 1992 in the Israeli system was called the Basic Law of Human Rights and Dignity. The Basic Law of Human Rights and Dignity specifically was a universalist document. The idea was that all citizens, similar to the aspirational language that's used in the Declaration, all citizens would be able to have freedom. It's like our First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of conscience. It's not exactly the same, but that's the parallel. The result of that document in the political discourse was, why do we have a universalist document and we don't have a particularist document? Why don't we have a document that says how we see ourselves as a Jewish state? And that began the legislative process for thinking about the nation-state bill, which eventually was passed as the nation-state law in July. The nation-state law, if you read it carefully, in many ways, if you look at the text, does not feel highly problematic, right? It feels as if, okay, this is a group of people who are the majority of this country who are trying to define how this sovereignty has Jewish character. But when you read it in conversation with the Declaration of Independence and the 1992 Basic Law of Human Rights and Dignity, you begin to see that this is a document that only speaks to the Jewish citizenry and absolutely marginalizes those who are non-Jews. There's a relegation of the Arabic language to a subordinate position to Hebrew. There's a question about the positioning of the Arabs in relation to the state. And there's a question in terms of the identity and the responsibilities the state has to those citizens. The fact that in the halls of the Knesset this was passed in the wee hours of the morning and a very convoluted coalition secretive discussion also tells you that this was not above board, that there were issues in the political landscape that were against this. This nation-state law received a lot of attention over the summer. There were many protests over the summer, and the protests first did not come from the Palestinian Arabs, but rather from the Druze. The Druze who are committed citizens to the state of Israel, who serve in the Israeli army. Because the Druze, as citizens, said, this marginalizes us. This does not speak to us as citizens, and we feel very Israeli, but this does not take into account our minority status. This, of course, then also was a conversation with the Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of the state of Israel, which elevated it more to a political level of discussion. This is a tension that is still playing out within Israel. This nation-state law is a tension that the Ministry of Education is quite concerned about, not because the Ministry of Education wants to diminish the nation-state law that has now passed, but rather because the question of civic education. Unlike in the American context, public schools do not function in the same way within Israeli society. I can tell you from growing up in the South, I learned about the war of northern aggression, right? I don't learn about the Civil War. Well, in Israel, it's very complicated in terms of the school system. You have 4 different streams of educational institutions. There is no real unifying narrative. I'm not talking about uniting, but unifying narrative in terms of the civic discussions. And the institution that is supposed to serve as the mechanism for socialization is the defense forces, the military, except two major sectors of the society, the Arabs and the Haredi, do not participate in that. So therefore, this lack of a civic discourse that can be an educationally organized entity that can create a strong sense of Israeliness does not exist in the current form of the State of Israel. The fourth piece relates specifically to security. In the Declaration of Independence, we read, "We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The State of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East." That aspiration has yet to be achieved. That issue around security has not ceased since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Whether it was continued when you see it in the events of 1948, whether you see it again in the border raids in the 1950s between Jordan and Egypt along the border of what will become the West Bank and Gaza, whether you see it in 1967, whether you see it in 1973, 1981, 1987, 1990s with terrorist attacks, 2000, Second Intifada, the assassination of Rabin in 95, the present in terms of the conflicts with Gaza. Israel has not experienced security, despite its aspirational desire. Of course, it's easy to say, well, this political entity didn't do Y, and this political entity didn't do X. But the reality is, until you have two peoples who prioritize this issue and recognize that security is of the utmost desire for its citizens, not just for the sovereignties, but for its citizens, it will not happen. You're also talking about a neighborhood in which there is complete turmoil. Syrians killing Syrians. Lebanese having no control because of Syria. Iraqis killing Iraqis. Egypt holding on to its power as tightly as possible so that it doesn't have to go down that way. Jordan holding on as tightly as possible. Turkey tightening the reins to not allow for any democratic practices. This is a challenging place. It's a place in which you see a great rightward shift to xenophobism. It's also a place in which you see great fear of Islamism. It's a place in which the vacuums that can be created can happen quickly and can have irreparable consequences. Israel recognizes this. Therefore, it prioritizes security, sometimes at the expense of other issues, because this is what allows Israel to succeed and to withstand and to remain in existence. It is not just about Palestinian inability and Palestinian lack of leadership, which is a huge component of this conversation, but it's also about the larger climate within the region. The question of whether Israel will be able at some point in time to have a two-state solution, what I call a two-state paradigm, which is what was articulated in 1937 with the Peel Commission, if everyone recalls. Again, articulated again in 1947. And in many ways articulated again after the events of the Six-Day War when you talk about land for peace with Resolution UN Resolution 242. That has been the basis for how both the international community, from Balfour, British, United Nations, have thought about forming a two-state possibility. Solomon's baby, cut it in half. The reality is that Israel recognizes without serious Palestinian leadership that can't happen. We see this in Gaza, where Hamas controls. Hamas has not been able at all to come to any kind of unified or unity government with the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority does not speak on behalf of all Palestinians in the West Bank. I recently spent time in Ramallah and Bethlehem, and with the individuals with whom I encountered, the majority of those Palestinians coming from a younger generation do not believe a two-state solution is even viable. They have no desire to even think about a two-state solution, and it's not because they want Hamas. They imagine a one-state entity. A one-state entity is a euphemism for the end of Israel. They say that a one-state entity is modeled on an American model, a state of all its citizens. They don't imagine that a Palestinian state is feasible, and they think it is anachronistic to create a state that has a particular identity that is not universally based. This is a major challenge to the state of Israel, irrespective of what administration is in place, whether it's a centrist, left of center, or a right of center government. Israel is still holding on to a two-state paradigm. That is what the majority of Israelis continue to want. And at the same time, they continue to vote for a right of center leadership because of those security concerns. And we do not know what will be. There are all different options on the table. Confederations, federations, one state, two state, but the framework that most think is still viable, at least from the outside, is a two-state framework, but that does not mean the people on the ground imagine it's possible. This is a major difference between reality and aspiration, and one in which I would argue we as American Jews actually have very little to contribute. And that is very hard for the younger generation to hear. Because this is not about how loud you yell, how much protesting you do about whether or not you understand the voice of the Palestinians, or if the Palestinians are part of the conversation in the Israel educational landscape. This is about decisions that are made by the individuals who live there, who are on the ground, who serve in the army, who pay taxes, and make sacrifices for the state. It doesn't mean that we, as a community, shouldn't be more educated. 100% we should. But to think that the American Jewish community can influence this is a bit naive in my mind. But it's important for us to understand the complexity around it. The last piece that I would like to mention relates to the challenges I said in terms of how you have a democracy, how democracies function. Just to lay out a few of these issues, and some we already talked about, but one, there is an absence of tradition in our Jewish tradition of a concept of a sovereignty. The Jewish historical experience developed under a condition of exile, right? It's the rabbis who teach us and who write about how the community stays together. It was without a responsibility for a geographic territory. This concept of a territory that we, as a Jewish community and Jewish people, have now for 70 years is a very short period of time compared to the amount of time in which we were living in a period of diaspora and organized in diaspora communities, each autonomous depending upon the geography and the location in which those communities lived. So Jews living in an Eastern orientation organized themselves differently than Jews living in a European context. It's important for us and for historians to remind us that this short period of time of 70 years, think about America during its first 70 years, was not a pretty time. There were a lot of inequalities that remained. So I think that's a piece we need to be mindful of. The second piece is that we have competing sources of authority. There are some within the Israeli Jewish community who see authority by only one, right? God. And that source of authority is the source of authority and cannot be at all in doubt. Judaism is a legalistic-based religion, and because of that, the legal code of halakha defines certain behaviors and practices. And there are rabbis who use that law and those legal practices as binding for how one engages in modernity as well. This poses a challenge to a nation state that sees itself having a character that is Jewish but is not theologically based. This is not a theocratic entity, right? It's not the rule of religion that defines the sovereign, secular, national law. So those competing sources of authority make it challenging in terms of its democratic practices. The composition of the population. Most citizens who are the citizens of the state of Israel were at one point in time refugees from different locations, from different territories, with different historical realities. Many Israelis who are now second, third generation, who are citizens in the state, who came from these locations, especially Jews coming from the Arab world, Jews coming from the former Soviet Union, lack the practice of democracy. They did not come from places in which democracy was the orientation of the sovereignty. That was not the tradition of the society in which they lived. They are learning that now as citizens of the state of Israel, which is very important to keep in mind. And then lastly, as we said, the existential threats that Israel faces, those challenges have impelled Israel to function in certain ways, to behave militaristically in certain moments, but it has to because it cannot afford to function as a sterile democracy. In America, we are blessed that we do not have any aggression with our northern or southern borders, at least not yet, right? Israel does not have that same geographical blessing. That is a challenge it faces as a democracy. I do not see these challenges as insurmountable. I think all of these challenges are surmountable. Some of them will come from leadership decisions that are made within the state. Some of them will come from influence because of philanthropic dollars. And some of them will happen because of strong Israel-diaspora relations, such as religion and state issues. Who can get married? Conversion issues. Who's a Jew? Those are the issues I think we, in the American Jewish context, can influence, much more so than whether or not there's a two-state paradigm. That being said, Israel is the laboratory of the Jewish people. So whether or not we live there or not, we have a role and a responsibility to educate ourselves about these issues, to think about the realities on the ground, and if they are possible to become part of the aspirational dream. The last thing that I'd like to say, and then I hope we can open it up to some questions. Tonight we start Chanukah, a people who was living in a Hellenistic period, a people who had to decide if they wanted to completely assimilate or if they were willing to hold on to their acculturation, right? They had, in many ways, been absorbed into society, but acculturated is different than assimilation. Acculturated means that you practice in that society, you engage in that society while retaining your particularism. We, in many ways, are those same Hellenistic Jews, right? We live in a society in which we are engaged, we are acculturated. But at the same time, our roots, our shorashim, root us deeply as particularistic Jews. And it's why we practice and engage in these conversations, and it's why they matter in the 21st century. And so I hope this evening on Chanukah, when you are lighting your candles and you're thinking about Shammai, and whether you light all 8 at once, or whether you follow Rabbi Hillel and light 1 this evening, that you think about the light these candles offer during the darkest nights of our year, and the possibility that they reverberate and reflect for us to be inspired to continue to engage in the conversations and the work that you all believe in terms of thinking about the complexities of being both a universalist and a particularist people. So thank you.